This is going to be weird. This is going to be very weird, actually. I'm recording a podcast, the next episode in a podcast, of which the last episode was literally years ago. And just continuing on with the next episode as if it's nothing. Alright. I'm actually recording a podcast. I'm sitting behind the mic, recording a video for the first time in what feels like forever. It's been quite a while since I've been a bit busy, and my entire time in Japan has basically been me trying to figure out how to fit my life around everything I want to do, which is why ever since I moved to Japan, my upload schedule has been really strange. And I know it's weird because to me it doesn't feel like I've been so much on a hiatus, but I know for everyone watching this channel, they know that, oh, Radix uploaded for the first time in like 2 months is like a regular occurrence. So that's a weird disconnect between me and the audience because I'm so busy, and like anytime I get a moment I record a video, so I get the impression that I'm always recording videos, but in reality I'm really not. But anyway, so whenever it's been a while since I've recorded a video, I'm always a little bit weird with the mic. I'm not in full entertainer mode, right? And so usually videos that come out after a hiatus are a bit weird. I'm obviously not in my groove. And what makes it even more weirder, to add to like a third element of this weirdness, is the topic of today's podcast. And it's a topic that I don't really plan on addressing on this channel this much, but I think that a huge shift has happened in my life it's been a slow shift. It's been a shift that's been happening since basically, since I moved to Japan. It's been like a 2-year-long shift, but now it's finally happened in my life, and I think I do need to make some sort of podcast, some sort of personal video, just to explain what's going on for people who don't know, just so you know where I'm coming from in future videos. It's not necessarily... How do I say this? It's tied into my worldview, and that is going to inform the way I make videos, but it's not going to be like... It's not going to infest, if you know what I mean. You'll understand what I mean once we get into the topic. And the topic of today's podcast will be my spiritual journey. Ooh. Go ahead and break out the live, laugh, love signs in the pumpkin spice lattes. We're getting spiritual up in here. Can you tell that I haven't recorded in a while and I'm not in the groove yet, and I'm kind of just winging it? I really am winging it here. But okay, so what I want to talk about is my spiritual journey and my road that brought me from what was essentially a materialist atheist, although not actually. It's complicated, we'll get into it, but what is essentially a very materialist atheist all the way to where I'm at right now. Depending on when you're listening to this, I might be becoming, is that right? I might be a catechumen in the Orthodox Church by the time this video comes out. I don't know. Probably not. I get the feeling I'm not going to be a catechumen yet, but probably soon. But yeah, this is the road to how I went from a materialist. This is the story of how I went from a materialist to being an Orthodox Christian, one of the most hardcore, super mystic spiritual sects of Christianity. Okay? Now, I want to preface this by saying that I have no intention on trying to convince people through my words to become Christian. The purpose of this video is not evangelization, right? This isn't a video about, why Christianity is the right religion. This isn't a video about why you should have religion. This is literally just, think of it like a diary entry. An entry in the life of Commander Radix, and some changes that I've been going through since I started this channel, really. And the reason I'm talking about this is because it's really informed how I view the world, and I use my channel kind of as a personal outlet. a creative outlet, and especially as I talk about things like history, religion, folklore, mythology on this channel, I want you to know the sort of background I'm coming from when I am talking about these subjects, okay? What my beliefs are, I guess, as it were. But yeah, this is not an evangelization project. I'm literally just explaining, just talking through, taking you on the journey with me of how I've made such a huge change in my life and what it has resulted in, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about here on I believe it's the 6th episode of the Commander's Cabin podcast. That's right, we're back with a vengeance, baby. Alright, so I'm not entirely going off the cuff here. I do have a piece of paper in front of me that has an outline of what I want to talk about, but it's sort of, it's not an outline. It's like an outline, but if you scrambled it, scrambled egg style, so it's not going to help me that much. But I guess I should start my spiritual journey at the beginning. Alright, so let's take out our Bibles and go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. No, just kidding. Alright, so spiritual beliefs, religious beliefs, beliefs of the world beyond, right? The world beyond what we can see, the world of the invisible, is intensely personal, and I don't view this podcast as an attack on you if you don't have the same beliefs on me. I really don't care. Alright, so where to start? Let's start with... This is the tricky part, so where to begin? I am from the borderlands of North Carolina, very close to South Carolina, alright? And that area is, especially when I was a child growing up, that area was predominantly Christian, okay? So there's sort of a, people are influenced by the world around them, right? I was born into the South. I was born into a world that was Christian. I was born into a world that was Protestant Christian. And even more specifically, evangelical, well, not all of them, but at the very least, the vocal ones, the ones that were visible, were evangelical Protestants. Mostly Southern Baptists, okay? So, for those of you who don't know much about the Southern Baptist denomination of Christianity, it's a Protestant denomination. It's considered very low church. If you don't know the difference, there's low church and there's high church. High church is when you walk in and there's the stained glass windows and, the great architecture and all this fancy insides. And low church is, it's like 4 white stone walls with some chairs, maybe folding chairs or something like that. In a high church, you'll have a priest wearing all these vestments. In a low church, you'll have a guy, if you're lucky, maybe in a suit. By the way, I don't want this podcast to come off as anti-Protestant. I don't want this video to come off as anti-Southern Baptist. Let me be clear, the Orthodox Christians... the Orthodox Christians believe that the Orthodox Church is the true church, right? And everything else is considered basically a heresy. And, you'll go online and you'll see a lot of Orthodox Christians clowning on Catholicism and the Protestants and all that. And, maybe I'm a bad Orthodox for believing this, but I actually don't have any qualms with other Christians. I see them as brothers, maybe separated, changed through time, right? But I still see them as Christians, and I still see them as, brothers, right? So I'm going to take a few jabs at other denominations here, but please understand that I mean no ill intent. I have great respect for all the different denominations, okay? So please don't take it the wrong way. It's very hard for me to speak positively about Southern Baptist as we go through this podcast. You'll understand why, but I just want to say I don't actually hate you. One of my best friends is a Southern Baptist preacher, or at least is going to seminary to become a preacher in the Southern Baptist Church. So please don't take this the wrong way. I say it. I say my unintentional jabs with love. That's what I'll say. Okay. So, evangelicalism. Southern Baptism, that's a weird way to say it, Southern Baptist Christianity. It's a very low church, very much non-liturgical, and as I understand it, liturgical is like, having church with reading the Bible, going through it, having certain days that are important, right? Not just like Christmas and Easter, but like saints' days, right? Southern Baptist churches are not liturgical. It's a lot more, maybe let's say pastoral, as I understand it, where the preacher isn't actually, it's not a priest, it's a preacher that's preaching ideas from Christianity. There isn't exactly a liturgical calendar, right? Of course they celebrate Easter and Christmas, but beyond that, as I understand it, it's not, they're not big on saints, right? They're not big on saints' days or feast days, right? They're not big on fasting, but that's the area I grew up in. Now, my family, and I don't know how much I can say or how much I should say, my grandparents were Protestants. On my dad's side were Southern Baptists. On my mom's side, I believe it was Presbyterian, which is another Protestant denomination. It's a little bit more... I don't think I should start ranking the Protestant churches. Let's move on. But also my grandmother was, born in the Empire of Japan and was officially on paper a state Shintoist for a while, but then went to moved to America and became a Christian, right? And then you have my parents, and they grew up in that environment that their parents brought them up in. Now, of course, I don't know the details about it, but at some point, I believe my dad, turned away from Southern Baptist Christianity, and I don't know when exactly in the timeline this happens, how it happens, why it happens, but at some point, as I understand it, he did more research into Christianity and found something more. Here's how I imagine it going down, and this might not exactly be how it was, but this is how I imagine it happening. That after a time in the Southern Baptist Church, I assume that he wanted to look more into Christianity, looked more into it, and realized that something like high church Christianity, something with apostolic succession, right? Something with priests and bishops that have a line of succession up to the original disciples, that is probably the real church and not the, maybe not, to him at least, the Southern Baptist Church. At that point, the apostolic church most accessible to you would be the Catholic Church. However, there's the big issue of the Pope, right? And it's one thing for there to be a Pope, as an Orthodox Christian, I understand that the role of the Pope was initially supposed to be first among equals, right? That he had a special place among the patriarchs, and, could be a tiebreaker, was very influential, but wasn't supposed to be the king, right? Wasn't supposed to be the arbiter of Christianity. Wasn't supposed to be the one who, if by himself he couldn't just make decisions affecting the jurisdiction of another church in, say, like Antioch or something. And then on top of that, changes in the Catholic Church, say Vatican I, for example, that not only solidified the idea of papal supremacy, but also the idea of papal infallibility, that the Pope can speak under certain conditions and on certain occasions in a way that is basically part of what Orthodox would call holy tradition. I'm not entirely sure if this applies to Catholics, if that term holy tradition applies, but basically that the Pope is infallible under certain conditions, under certain circumstances, and his word is law, right? And, it's one thing in the Orthodox Church when you have patriarchs, and if they can work in a consensus through the Holy Spirit, then yeah, they are able to create certain rulings here on earth as it is in heaven. But the problem with, as seen by me from Catholicism, is the power being given to one person, right? Rome is in schism with Constantinople and the rest of the original apostolic churches in the East. And now, to sort of make up for that, the Pope is like, okay, well, since I'm alone, I can make all the decisions. I don't need to have a consensus with all the other guys, right? And that is, especially when you consider a lot of corrupt popes, which, by the way, I'm not going to say that, oh, this pope is corrupt, therefore the papacy is invalid. No, there are corrupt and have been corrupt patriarchs in the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? The difference is that in Eastern Orthodoxy, if enough of them are not corrupt and they're able to work together in a consensus, then the Holy Spirit is there, while the Pope is just by himself. And if you have a corrupt Pope, well, you have a corrupt church for the time being, right? I think of Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander the Sixth. I might be wrong with the number on that, but he seems to me to be pretty corrupt. There have been some corrupt popes in the past. And things like Vatican I. I understand traditional Catholics have a lot of problems with Vatican II. I actually think Vatican I is where things go off the rails besides the whole papal supremacy thing. But anyway, this is becoming too anti-Catholic than I want it to be. I love the Catholics. Please don't crucify me. I'm sorry. I don't mean to. This is such a tricky issue for me to be talking about off the cuff. Wow. Anyway, I have a feeling my dad saw that, came to that conclusion, and said, welp, are there any high churches that have apostolic succession in the West that do not have, have to bow the knee to the Pope in Rome? And that is how I assume he found Anglicanism, specifically the Episcopal Church of the United States, right? Because you're not going to join the Church of England when you live in America, right? That doesn't make sense. But the Episcopal Church. And my dad went to the Episcopal Church, and then my mom went with him, and they went to the Episcopal Church. I, as a baby, was actually, baptized in the Episcopal Church, although I don't think I was chrismated or confirmed, I think they call it. But I was baptized, as I understand it, in the Episcopal Church. I don't remember ever attending it, though. But anyway. So yeah, I don't really remember attending it. So basically, even though I was baptized, throughout my whole young life, I didn't really have a strong idea about what Christianity was. My parents didn't really talk about it that much. They eventually stopped attending the Episcopal Church when they started doing things that weren't biblical, and instead were more in the spirit of the age, if you know what I mean. But anyway. So yeah, they stopped attending church. I grew up, without really knowing what Christianity was. On paper, I understood myself to be Christian, but if you had ever asked me what that meant, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I would know that there was a guy who said he was the Son of God named Jesus, who was killed on a cross, and then something that saved us, whatever that means, and then, yeah. And I knew that there was a flood and an ark, and Noah somehow put 2 of every animal on it. That's about it. I don't think I really had an idea who Moses was. Not really sure what a Holy Spirit was or what a Trinity is. Now, when I was young, I did go to summer Bible school at, I think it was the Presbyterian Church. It was a low church Protestant evangelical thing that I went to a few years. Mostly because I think my grandparents wanted my parents to put me in it, and they're like, okay, let's make the grandparents happy, and then I went there. But I have some memories of that Bible school, but honestly, the Bible school is probably what made me turn away from Christianity in the long run, because it was in a very low church Protestant evangelical setting, and I just did not jive well with it. Low church evangelical Protestantism, to me, oh, am I still recording? I hope I'm still recording. Okay. It seems to me to be a bit anti-intellectual. A little bit anti-intellectual, that you're supposed to accept everything on faith, right? and that it's your faith that saves you. So even more important than actually doing good things is actually having faith, believing, and the emphasis on believing leads it to becoming a sort of blind devotion where you're not allowed to ask questions. And I remember asking questions in Bible school and just not getting a very encouraging answer. Like they told me just to accept it or just say because it says so in the Bible. And to me, like, that doesn't work. You know, even little elementary or middle school Commander Radix, if you told him, you have to believe this because it's in the Bible, I'm going to go, right, that's not a strong enough source for me. Not that, you know, that's not to disrespect the Bible or anything, but at that time, I didn't look at the Bible as a source that was in and of itself authoritative, because it had yet to be proven to me that this book was something special. I've heard that it was special, but I didn't see any evidence of it being special. It's filled with stories that were impossible for me to understand at that age. Right. I did, as a child, read Genesis and Revelation, and it didn't really stick with me. But yeah, it was long, it was hard to read. You know, you have a lot of strong King James onlyism going on in there. And King James is like one of the hardest translations to read. So yeah, it didn't really work. Now, on the flip side of that, at the same time, I was really into natural science. I was really into dinosaurs for a while. I still do like dinosaurs. But there was one book, I always read dinosaur books looking at pictures of dinosaurs and going, wow, 65 million years ago, you know, there were dinosaurs on this earth. That's awesome. And here are the fossils. Here are the literal bones, you know, of the fossils. But then, like, when it comes to church, it's like, oh, I can't bring my Harry Potter book into church because it's wizardry. Oh, I can't, you know, the dinosaurs weren't actually real because they're not in the Bible. Oh, how are these bones 65 million years old when the earth is only 6,000 years old, right? You know, you get a lot of that in the Southern Baptist, you know, section of Christianity. And that always seemed off to me. And then I had a book that was really outdated, a book from, like, I feel like it's from the 70s, that went through the history of life. It went through evolution. And of course, I always looked at the dinosaur section. I'm like, wow, there's dinosaurs in here. Then I flip a few pages and now there's woolly mammoths. And you know, woolly mammoths never really captured my attention like a T-Rex. But eventually, I think it was in middle school, I actually sat down and read that book from beginning to end. And it talked about the Big Bang, the spread of the galaxies, the formation of celestial bodies from the debris left over of the Big Bang, the you know, how this was a hot, you know, moltenous planet, that the steam came down and became water eventually, and then you have this weird primordial water soup, and in this weird soup the first cell emerges, you know, the first sort of bacteria, and then it grows, and then it grows, and then it evolves, and single cell organisms become multicellular organisms, and then they grow and they become things like trilobites, and you know, those sort of, there's the Cambrian explosion where you get all these different creatures popping up. And then eventually you have fish. And then some idiot fish decides, hey, look at these plants that are starting to grow on the ground. I want to eat me some of these plants. And then starts coming up out of the water like a freak of nature, you know, to consume plants or whatever. And then it all goes downhill from there. Eventually they start staying there. They turn into reptiles eventually. Eventually some of them even start to get fur, become mammals, and then eventually get dinosaurs, which is pretty cool. And I'm like, okay, all right, maybe this whole fish guy coming out of the water isn't so bad. But then, of course, 65 million years ago, that explosion had to ruin all the fun, and now you have like millions of years of millions of years of history that's just little rodents running around the ground. Like, wow, that's really exciting. That's really anticlimactic after the dinosaur arc. But But then eventually, you have these little rodents that turn into things like lemurs, that turn into things like monkeys, that turn into things like, some sort of primate, that are living in the jungle. But eventually, the jungles are disappearing, and one group has to decide if they want to stay in the trees, and one group has to decide to, risk getting killed by a saber-toothed tiger by looking for nuts on the ground where there is no trees to cover them. Eventually they go their separate ways. The ones that decide to, be crazy and pick up nuts from the ground where there are saber-toothed tigers have to learn to run. They start standing upright, Over time they're eating meat, they become smarter, and then gradually over time we get Homo sapiens. Right. So I read that book and it was fascinating to me. It was written in language that was easy for me at my age to understand, and to me it explained everything. I saw so much of, what's in that text, and looking at it, I'm like, wow, I know how we came to be here, how we reached this point now. I know the history of the earth now, and it is amazing. That book had a big impact on me. Which is weird because I don't remember the title. It was something like Children's Science Journal, Volume 1978 or something like that. It wasn't a title that rolls off your tongue. But yeah, that was a very influential thing. And over time, in school as well, you learn things about science, you learn about DNA, you learn about evolution, and it all made sense to me, right? And I'm like, okay, I am, with the information available to me, I am more able to think that this was how it happened, and that religion is something that sort of was developed out of the necessity for, rules, the search for answers that people didn't have a way of knowing at that time. And I want to make it clear that I know so many people who entered a weird edgy atheist phase where they just hated religion. Someone would say bless you when they sneezed and they would reply with God's not real, right? I was never like that. I was never anti-religion. I always had a deep respect for religion, especially Christianity. But with what I learned in school, what I read, I was able to accept the model where religion sort of formed as part of human society instead of, a god creating everything and then being a person, and then, Noah putting all these animals on an ark and surviving a flood, and then, I didn't really know much about Christianity then, so that was basically to me what Christianity was. Then God somehow, for some reason, sending a son, and in Baptist school, in Bible school, one of the old ladies who worked there mentioned that Jesus was God, and I was confused, and I said, Jesus isn't God, he's the Son of God, right? And then the woman's like, no, don't say that. Instead of explaining to me the Holy Trinity and explaining how that all worked, how hypostatic union worked, she just says, don't ask that. I'm like, don't say that. And I'm like, oh, okay, that doesn't seem right. That was a big shock to me. I always had questions at Bible school that I never received an answer. Instead, we just had to learn how to sing Our God is an Awesome God and do the right hand motions for that. So I remember when I was in elementary school and I had learned all this stuff, and I was at the lunch table with some friends, and I sort of looked out the window, looked at the trees, and then looked back at my friends and said, guys, is there any evidence that God exists? This is me, I think this was 4th grade, asking this question, and the kid in front of me eating down on a sandwich says, yeah, look around you. Which, wasn't an argument that was effective for 4th grade Commander Radix. Although, weirdly enough, we'll get to the topic of how the issue of why is there something instead of nothing really bothered me, later on when I became an adult. But so I do think there was wisdom in those words that I just couldn't see when I was in 4th grade. Look around you wasn't an acceptable answer to me because I already had an answer for everything that I saw around me, right? because I had read that book, the Kids Science Journal 1978 or whatever, and I had paid attention in science class, and I saw dinosaur books, and the Christians are telling me that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, but I know for a fact the dinosaurs died 65 million years ago. Something's not adding up, right? So yes, that was sort of the world I was, born into. And then especially into middle school, when I was learning more about sort of my Japanese roots, in Japan you have Buddhism and Shinto, which is funny because I never really got into Buddhism. Probably because it was complicated. But Shinto was interesting to me. The idea that there were kami, the idea that there were gods inhabiting the world, in everything and everyone and everywhere, right? These spirits that are morally neutral, more or less. That there are things like water that purify you. That, Shinto, which is inherently an old world pagan religion, right? Shinto was a little bit more interesting to me, mostly because there was no moral code that didn't make sense to me. There was no, so basically around this time I'm still calling myself Christian, I think. But I'm functionally materialist. I only believe in the world I can see. Although at the same time I was open to the idea of there being sort of spirits, of there being ghosts, of there being angels and demons, and it's weird that I could accept angels and demons, but the idea of there being a god was a little bit weird to me. That's weird, but that I was open to that sort of stuff, that those could exist. And especially because you hear all the ghost stories from your friends and family, and you're like, oh wow, how do you explain that? So I was open to there being a world beyond what I can see, or what I could see, but at the same time I never realized that that sort of openness was in conflict with my my functionally materialist outlook, right? I never really put two and two together. But Shinto made more sense to me. Right, I was much more interested in Shinto, which is why, all across this channel you'll see me reciting Shinto myths, right? And there are more to come. But, that was interesting to me. Anyway, where am I going with this? Let me check my outline. Background, Shinto, Southern Baptist. I've respected Christianity. Yeah, and I never really received any religious instruction from my parents, right? They sort of left me to do my own thing, and I think that is the correct choice. I could see that if they had, from a young age, tried to force Christianity on me, I might have become one of those edgy atheist teenagers that are, bless you, God doesn't exist, right? I could have become that, but because my parents were so lax with that, I think that really gave me a chance to explore things for myself and come to my own conclusions without any sort of dormant prejudices or, traumas or whatever. So I think, that was probably the best bet, the best thing to do as parents. But the full, the point where I stopped calling myself a Christian was about when I was in high school. I had a girlfriend. She was a militant atheist. Her parents were Catholics who, tried to force her to go to church, tried to force things on her. She got really angry about that. At the same time, she was really interested in science. She got, just like I was talking about, got upset, had a prejudice against Christianity, broke away, became a very militant atheist. If you said bless you to her, she would say God's not real, right? God's not real was her catchphrase for a time. She wrote a mock version of the Bible called Tebibble, where she basically made fun of the Bible in baby speech. She was not a fun person. But anyway. But I was with her, and, I didn't really have a strong faith, if any faith at all. And I kind of said, you know what, yeah, this is kind of weird. This is kind of stupid. This is just a bunch of superstitions. It's not really scientific. It's not making any dollars. It's not making any sense. And I was with her, and then we broke up, but that's okay. That's for the best. But that left me out of that relationship. Oh, did my computer just shut down? No, it did not. Okay, but that left me out of that relationship being essentially a materialist atheist. But I never crossed the line like she did. I never hated Christianity. Again, I had always had a respect for it, right? But anyway, into college, I sort of cultivated a fully materialist outlook, right? The first day of college, one of my history professors came in, talked about what is history, then mentioned religion and how people in the past used to use religion to understand history. But then he said, but those are all fairy tales, they're nonsense, we need to ignore those. That's what he said at my college. And yeah, so for a long time I spent as a materialist atheist. I still respected religion, respected not just Christianity, but other religions as well. But I no longer considered myself a Christian. But I always felt like something was missing. Well, actually, before we get even into that, let's talk about how I sort of tried to tried to make fit my idea that religion was respectable and my materialist outlook. I actually did. I've been a traditional person, generally speaking, my whole life. I've sort of had a traditional outlook on life. And I sort of respected people in the past. By this point in time, I've become a history nerd. And I always sort of looked up to the past. Not that every moment in the past was better than where we are right now, but there definitely are points in the past that are better than how society is right now. That's what I'll say. But I also believed in sort of the good in people, and that people wouldn't just lie and have that lie be accepted by a whole lot of people as an important story. And I looked at the Bible, and I didn't look at it as nonsense. I looked at it as sort of an ancient memory of events that happened in the past, but didn't happen as they were described in the Bible. And this went for every religion as well. I believed in mythology. I believed that they were describing events that happened deep in history, that, this is being written at a time before the Enlightenment, before the historical method popped up, so it's not going to follow the way we create history today, how we define history today, how we record it today, through a synthesis of primary sources and with a critical eye. But instead it was going to use old ways of recording history that could include things like blowing up certain heroic characters to religious proportions. A great king all of a sudden becomes a god, right? How Julius Caesar was hailed as a god in Rome after his death and all that. And that all these myths popped up as sort of a memory of what happened. But not actually how it happened. I always believed that the Trojan War in some way, shape, or form happened. But, I didn't believe that, the gods were there. Aphrodite got her hand stabbed by a Greek soldier. I didn't believe that. I believed that the Iliad was recording some sort of faint memory of a Bronze Age war between the Mycenaean Greeks and whoever was living on Anatolia at that time. Maybe a Hittite tributary state or something. So I wasn't really fond of attacking religion. I thought religion had its value. But I didn't look at it as other people looked at it, as actual religious people looked at it. I'm gonna go on break here. Okay, well, that was supposed to be like a 30-minute break. Ended up being like a 2-week break. So quite a lot of time has passed between me recording that first half, maybe it's a half, and this half of the podcast. So, whoops. But anyway, let's continue with my spiritual journey. So I did listen through that first half, and there's something I want to clarify. I kept saying that I respected religion, I respected Christianity and all that, and I want to clarify what I meant by that. Because, in the world of, and it's been a while since I've recorded again, so I'm not going to be on my proper flow state, but in a world where, where I describe that sort of militant atheist that hated religion, I never understood that hate, and I respected religion, and what I respected was how so much of human achievement was created through religion. Now, there's an old meme that's like this very random, abstract line graph that's showing like human progression, and then there's like a big decline in the graph, and it says the Dark Ages created by Christianity, and then it continues to grow up after like the Renaissance and all that. There's this idea that Christianity has held back civilization, when the opposite is really true. So many scientific advancements and revolutions were created through, people who were Christians. The scientific revolution in and of itself was a Christian innovation, right? So I respected religion in that it helped build up society, and I thought that taking it away from society wasn't a good idea for society. So turning society into a rampant anti-religious place probably wasn't going to work out well for society. That's what I meant by I always respected religion, even if I, at that time, couldn't follow it myself. Anyway, moving on, I think where we left off with me being a materialist atheist, sort of going into college, and then after college, and I guess the next step in my spiritual development, as it were, was me moving to Japan, alright? So in 2019, I left the United States, and I went out to Japan. I moved to Japan. I actually moved to the countryside. I moved to a very, very, very remote part of the countryside. I don't want to give too many details away, but because I don't want to dox myself, but I moved to one of the most remote parts of the country. Very rural, very much countryside, nature everywhere. And from my apartment balcony, I would look out from my balcony and see in the distance to my left, I would see, green mountains, lush green mountains. To my right were also green mountains. And then before me was, a path leading up to the dock. Some of you might have heard like the ship horns back in the days when I lived at that apartment. But there was a dock in front of me, and then just the crystal blue sea. And then across the sea, you could see another island just looming in the distance, all green. And it's hard to describe how beautiful the nature was there. And I would go there, I would just chill on my balcony for a long time because there's not much anything else to do when I lived there. This is my first apartment. I'm living in my second apartment. This was the Rad Cave, and I live in the Rad Fort now, right? but in the Rad Cave days. And I would spend a lot of time on that balcony looking at the sunset, looking at the sunrise. When it was night, because I lived in a place with a very, very, very low population, the night sky was... I don't know a word that can describe the night sky. You could see the Milky Way. You could clearly see shooting stars. It was like you see photographs that are specially done up to show the night sky, and it looked like that, but just with your eyeball, right? It was incredible that I lived in such a remote, quiet, and it was so quiet. You would go out, you would stand on the balcony of my apartment on a Saturday afternoon, and you would hear nothing but maybe the birds. If you really tried to train your ear hard, you could maybe hear the ocean, but you couldn't hear any other humans. And it was just incredible. And it was the first time that I really lived in such nature. Like, yeah, I lived in the rural South, but it wasn't the same. It's not the same level of rurality, as it were. I was there living in primordial land when I moved to Japan. And just spending so much time on the balcony at evening, at afternoon, in the morning, at night. and just looking out on this beautiful landscape. And I thought, wow, it's beautiful. And there's really no easy way to describe this. I don't know how to describe this. Yeah, there's really no way to describe it. But like, as I'm standing there on my balcony for, take every day for about a year, I'm standing out there looking out into the distance. And over time, I eventually go, wait a minute. There isn't a way to describe what happened. But after enough time, I kind of thought, wait a minute. And really, through all that time standing on the balcony and looking into this beautiful scenery of nature that I was lucky enough to live in, just over time I came to the conclusion that the soul existed. Okay, so I came to the conclusion, and I cannot sort of describe how do I describe to you a year-long process of me every day standing out looking into the most exquisite scenery of nature? I cannot describe that. I cannot put that into words. But it's simply through that I discovered that the soul was something that existed. Because before that, with my materialist brain, I thought that, who we are coincidences, we're accidents. Everything that makes us, our consciousness, is made through tubes in our brains, and chemicals and hormones and reactions going on in our brains cause us to take action in the world. Our feelings are the result of chemicals responding to certain stimuli, right? That's sort of how I thought of the person, right? What a person is. And, it's funny, it's like when Ebenezer Scrooge denies the ghost of Christmas present by, like, being, this guy is just a hallucination from some cheese I ate. And then the ghost of Christmas present is like, soured cheese? Like, you're denying me based on these materialist factors when I'm right before your eyes? But anyway. So I come to the conclusion that the soul exists, and I cannot put into words how I came to that conclusion. That's something you're only going to be able to understand if you had went through the experience I did. And I came to the conclusion that the soul existed. The soul. What is the soul? It's some sort of abstract spiritual essence that makes an individual, right? Something unique to the human being, right? And something that cannot be measured by science, because, there was a lot of effort done to try to prove or disprove the soul, measuring people dying, and if they died, did they lose weight, and was that the weight of the soul, right? Was the soul in the heart? Well, what happens if something damages the heart? Is it in the brain, where you can still live even if we pierce the brain? In fact, your brain can change its entire personality if you're lobotomized, right? So it's like, well, where is the soul? The soul is nowhere. There's no such thing as a soul. But I came to believe in the soul, and that was the first time that I believed with conviction in something that was not scientific, right? Something that was not met by the scientific theory. And, when you live a life believing that everything can be explained through science, even if it's not something science can answer right now, it will be something that it can answer eventually. When you come into a conviction that something does exist that the scientific theory will never be able to prove or disprove, then that sort of causes some dominoes to fall. That makes you realize that there is a sort of reality that exists beyond just the empirical material reality that we exist in. And at this point I got really interested into things like quantum physics, things that suggest that there are other realms. I got really interested in, what was it? So this ties back to when I was in 4th grade and I asked, is there any evidence God exists? And the kid says, just look around you. Here I was literally looking around me at this remote place in the Japanese countryside when I realized that there was something more than just scientific material reality. So that's what I mean by the wisdom in those words. Just looking around me kind of led me to that conclusion. But I got really interested into the issue of why there was something rather than nothing at all, right? So, before middle school, high school, I accepted the Big Bang Theory as an explanation for reality. I hadn't really looked too much into it, I just sort of accepted it. Then, after I came to the conclusion that the soul exists, well, then I had to ask the question, okay, where does the soul come from? Okay, we have something that's not scientific and is invisible and not part of material reality. What are the implications of that? Where does this come from, right? And so then I decided, all right, let's try to see what we know about reality itself. And I looked at the Big Bang, and I realized that the Big Bang doesn't actually explain, the Big Bang at its root is an explanation for the expansion we see in the universe. It's an explanation for the movement we see between the stars, between celestial bodies, the gradual expansion that began around 13.8 billion years ago, right? It shows that everything expanded from one super dense point. What it does not explain is where that super dense point came from. So it isn't exactly an explanation for the beginning of space. It is an explanation for the expansion of space, or at least things in space. It's also not an explanation of time. It is an explanation of relative time, as in, how do you measure time? There is a relative time where you see that time is measured by the difference of time between moments, right? If nothing is moving, nothing at all in the universe is moving, then the meaning of time kind of becomes meaningless, but that doesn't mean that time doesn't exist. It just stops being relative, right? So the Big Bang doesn't explain really objective time. Relative time, yes. You see things move once the Big Bang puts things into motion, but not the dimension of time itself. Theoretically, let's say that we rewind the clock back to the moment right before the Big Bang where everything is in one dense point. And then we go 12 years before that. It's going to look completely identical. But that doesn't mean that the concept of 12 years before that doesn't exist. It doesn't mean if you try to time travel, you hit a wall, right? It's not like that. It's just that things don't move anymore. Time becomes meaningless, but not that it doesn't exist. The laws of physics state that an object at rest has the tendency to stay at rest unless force is exerted upon it from the outside. That, to me, when I reflected on that, really got me thinking, wait a minute, right? Because, alright, we have the Big Bang, we have the first movement, we have the first effect, we have the Big Bang. But then the question is always going to be what caused the Big Bang. And of course, there are multiple theories to this. We could be in a never-ending cycle of big bangs, then big crunches, and everything goes back to one point and then explodes back out into another big bang, and then we are following endless cycles, endless kalpa of universes, right? But then that will still go back to the question of, okay, what happened to the first kalpa? What happened to the first universe, the first Big Bang? What caused that, right? There's the theory that we could be in a sort of multiverse, but then again, I have to ask, how did the multiverse begin? How did it begin? There's the theory that we are in a simulation run by extra-dimensional, all-powerful beings, but then where did they come from, right? And the problem is, okay, let's say there's God, right? You can easily take what I'm saying right now and say, okay, Commander Radix, I see where you're going with this. You're going to say that God caused the Big Bang. But where does God come from, okay? And here's what sort of made me how do I say this? If we follow a purely scientific model, we are going to have problems because at some point the universe is operating on non-scientific principles, which means that science isn't, as we understand it right now, isn't the be-all end-all to understanding reality. If we take a concept that is not scientific, like a god, like a prime mover, in the purest sense of that word, the first cause, the force that doesn't require a force from an outside area to be exerted upon it to make a movement. How did this sentence start? If we take a non-scientific principle, we aren't obligated to ask scientific questions about it, right? If we go purely by science, we're always going to crash into the problem of, okay, what caused this cause? Then what caused that? Then what caused that? And there has to be a first cause that has no external force implemented onto it. There has to be something that was uncreated. And when you take a non-scientific principle like God, let's take the theologians, they say that God is uncreated. What created God? That doesn't make sense with the concept of God. And if we try to implement the idea that something created God, then everything falls apart, because then we fall into the same trap that a purely scientific model of the universe would have us fall into. Because, okay, then what created that? And that created God. Eventually, logically speaking, you have to run into something that is not created, that exists, right? And that's crazy. That's crazy, but a god is the only, a non-scientific principle, we'll say, because at this point, when I'm reflecting on this, when I'm going through, I just realized the soul exists moment, I'm still not sold on, organized religion. I'm still not sold on I'm not working with the understanding that the truth is something humanity knows, right? I'm not like, oh, the soul exists, therefore all these church councils from the Middle Ages must be accurate. That's not the leap that I went, right? I went from, okay, the soul exists, what are the implications of this? Where else is science, quote-unquote, failing, right? And how could these be connected? That's what I was looking at. And so I came to the conclusion that there must have been some sort of prime mover, some unscientific principle that led to the creation of the universe. Okay? At first I thought of, I think there's some Greek philosophy, pseudo-religion called monadism or something, where souls come from this eternal creator, and then that they when you die, that soul returns to this substance of the soul returns to that monad or something like that. My first sort of conception was something like that, because I was very reluctant. Again, I looked at the Bible, I looked at Christianity, and I looked at all the religions of the world as something that might have a shred of truth into each of them, but there's no way that humanity could understand and could have understood from the Bronze Age how the world came to be and all of that, right? I looked at it as superstition that sometimes touches up on the truth. That's what I looked at religion. So I didn't go to any sort of religion when I was following this trail, okay? So being, still materialist brained, still, looking to science, I began to look at some more scientific, quote-unquote, and I know that there will be people who take issue with me using the word scientific the way I am. I'm using scientific sort of as a alternative to religion that is more widely acceptable in the spirit of the age, if you know what I mean, okay? So, some of this could be pseudoscience, really it doesn't matter to me. That's not what I'm not trying to make that distinction right now. I'm using the term scientific to sort of diverge it from what we would traditionally think of as religion, is what I'm saying right here. So scientifically, I looked for scientific, even on the fringe, but scientific sources that could lead me more into understanding what this world beyond was, because I especially wanted to believe, oh, maybe we are stored in our souls, and if we die, that soul returning to the source could be a sort of afterlife, even though probably we wouldn't keep our individual identities in that monad or whatever. And then maybe it's possible, substance of a soul could be reused on another person that was born later in life, and that could be a sort of reincarnation-like deal. I had a lot of ideas flowing through my head. I went looking into other sources. I learned more about, this is going to get into some stereotypical Reddit territory. I'm going to warn you right now. But I looked at things like, let's start with Carl Jung. I looked a lot into Carl Jung. Now, in the modern era, there were basically two main psychologists, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And I always hated Sigmund Freud because just looking at his theories just looks wrong right at the get-go. And his main rival was Carl Jung, and I always thought that Carl Jung was a little bit more on the, right path than Sigmund Freud. And I knew that Carl Jung looked into some weird stuff that I just sort of ignored when I was completely materialist, but now I'm looking at, maybe there is a world beyond that we can see. So I was looking into Carl Jung stuff he said, and I was looking into things like synchronicity. And the idea that in a scientific universe there wouldn't be anything of there wouldn't be any such thing as an accident. And that events that have perceived deeper meaning likely do have deeper meaning. And I studied archetypes and all that, and that was fascinating to me. But synchronicity, the concept of synchronicity, gave me a little bit more confidence to look into, the spiritual and the unseen world as being something that has some sort of support from the scientific consensus. Even though it's not the consensus, it's basically Jung going crazy writing his books or whatever. But I looked into, things like the pineal gland and DMT, how there's this hallucinogenic drug that when people take this drug, they see entities, and people who repeatedly take this drug can sometimes encounter the same entity that can remember past events. How this drug was used in certain research projects by different national secret agencies, and how there was an experiment done where a couple people did DMT together and they all saw the same entity in the room with them. It was a shared hallucination, which isn't a thing that should happen, right? How it activates into the pineal gland, how the pineal gland is at the core of the brain and it's sort of calcified by a lot of our needs by being, humans. Our food needs, our water needs, our need to sleep. But if you can bypass that, it's sort of, the weird Reddit gurus say it accesses the spiritual world. And how they encounter these entities, and these entities say how they've been waiting to meet them and all that. I looked a lot into near-death experiences, NDEs, where people, the story, they die in a car crash and have to be resuscitated later, but how so many people have these stories about them looking over their own bodies, how some people have stories of them feeling that they're being dragged down to hell. So a lot of people encounter loved ones, some even, religious figures, right? And looking to all this told me that yeah, there is something beyond. There is a spiritual world. Now, even with things like DMT, the Buddhist monks always said this is not how you're supposed to encounter these entities. You're supposed to encounter it through discipline and meditation. And if an unprepared person just takes this drug, they are at risk of going insane, right? There's risk involved. So I didn't really look at the druggies doing DMT as wow, I want to do that. It always seemed to me I don't know if those entities are are friendly. I don't know if those are, people we can trust. Especially when all the major religions say don't mess with them. But I came to the conclusion that all religions in some way, shape, or form were grasping onto the truth, but that I didn't think that any one of them could have the entirety of the truth. And the philosophy or religion that's called is called perennialism. And so for maybe a few months, I thought of myself as a perennialist. I thought of myself as believing that all these religions had some sort of truth to them, but none could have the full truth. All right. And so that's where I was. I went from a, materialist atheist to a perennialist. Okay? And now we go on, how did I go from being a perennialist to a Christian? So, I have a friend, I would consider him my best friend, probably, who is really, really into Christianity. Very deep into Christianity. I believe his heritage is in the Southern Baptist Church, but that he eventually went his own way and sort of did same thing that I imagine my father did, of looking more into the tradition of the church, and eventually became an Anglican. He is Anglo-Catholic, believing in the holy tradition of Anglicanism. Not ready to take the plunge into actual Catholicism due to issues with things like the Pope. But he does believe that there needs to be some sort of high church organization. And so he's an Anglican. He is in the Anglican Church in North America, ACNA. Which, again, Anglicanism can be a big tent sort of group. ACNA tends to be, as I understand it, more. So when the Episcopal Church was doing their thing that was unbiblical, ACNA kind of divided from it. This is the same time as when my family stopped attending the Episcopal Church. Some Episcopalian churches broke away from the Episcopal Church of the United States, broke away from the Anglican Communion, but still maintained the Anglican tradition and became ACNA, the Anglican Church of North America, or in North America. And so that's what my best friend was a part of. And he is well-versed in Christian history, church history, in the saints, in the church fathers, and all that jazz. And I do weekly calls with him. We talk a lot. He's probably the only person I talk to regularly, come to think of it. But he always, through talking with him and learning more about Christianity from him, I learned that there was more to Christianity than I had thought. Because my impression of Christianity was literally just, evangelical Protestantism, and I didn't think that was something that had any truth to it. And that, to me, was what Christianity was. But my friend told me a lot about, the ancient church history, the beginnings of the church, the saints, and all that. And over time, especially once I accepted that the soul existed, things slowly started to make more sense. I could start to see how Christianity was a viable religion. And at the same time, I was doing research on, I was looking into miracles in different religions. Things like milk coming out of a Buddhist statue's eyes. Things like Muhammad breaking the moon, all that jazz. And I was looking into miracles, and I thought, surely, if any of these religions are right, there would be miracles that explicitly point out to this religion. And all these different religions do have miracles associated with them, but I was especially impressed with a lot of Catholic miracles. I was especially impressed with things like Marian apparitions. Now, if you don't know, there are these things, Marian apparitions, where every now and then Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, would show up in the world, say something and leave, or do something and leave, right? And that was impressive to me. The one that really got me interested was something called Our Lady Fatima. This was in Portugal during World War I, where a group of kids were playing around and suddenly they encounter the Virgin Mary. And the Virgin Mary tells them things like praying for the conversion of Russia and all that stuff. We have to save Russia. This is right before the Russian Revolution breaks out. She appears like 3 times, and the kids tell their parents, and the church is like, oh, what's going on here? And then eventually they... I forget the details, but like Mary was like, bring everyone here at this time and then they will see me. So the kids bring this huge crowd of people with a lot of like news reporters and all that stuff are brought to this point that Mary told them to go to. And then all of a sudden something happens with the sun. I think some stories have like the sun sort of moves in different ways. And when I told this story to my friend, he remarked to me, and at this point I had not read the Bible, right? He remarks that it sounds very similar to Saul, later Paul's conversion, quote-unquote conversion, on the road to Damascus when he encountered Christ. And so I'm like, oh, there's like a biblical connection here. But ultimately, so many primary sources say that on that day something happened. Of course, there are sources that say nothing happened, but the same thing can be said about what happened on the road to Damascus. Because not all people saw Christ on the road to Damascus in that incident. But I am a historian. I have written actual articles for historical organizations. I am well trained in how to conduct history, and I know that in order for an event to be considered true, you need to have several primary sources from different backgrounds. And the Our Lady Fatima incident, for me as a historian, I was shocked that I had not heard about it before, and I was shocked that it wasn't like taken as fact that that was proof of Christianity immediately, because it met all the qualifications for history, for a historical event to be recorded, you know, as it was, because we have so many eyewitness accounts. The Our Lady Fatima event was crazy to me. That was the event that made me go, oh. You know, and it's not like something vaguely spiritual, like milk coming out of a Buddhist statue's eyes. It's not something that's purely from one text and doesn't seem to have any cosmological backing, like Muhammad breaking the moon. It was a well-attested historical event. And it was Mary, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, who was explicitly telling these kids these Christian ideas, nothing vaguely spiritual, but explicitly Christian things, praying for Russia at a time where Russia's about to go down into one of the bloodiest oppressions of Christians in history. That was impressive to me. And then from there on, I just continued to look into these, and I was impressed with the Catholic Church. I was impressed with how they looked into it. Like, they didn't go, oh, here's this folk tale that, you know, proves that we're right, let's accept it. No, they sent people to investigate. A long process happened before the church accepted it. And then I'm looking into, like, oh, the Catholic Church actually has a very in-depth process on determining whether or not a miracle is valid or not, whether or not it's true or not. Like, they don't just accept it right off the bat. And I look into all these different Catholic miracles, especially apparitions of Mary, and it's like, whoa. this is incredible. But I don't know why that wasn't the nail in the coffin, but that was what led me to sort of believe that Christianity might have more to it than the other religions. I should mention that at the same time, you know, I'm living alone, I'm by myself in a foreign country. I'm trying to make myself better. Self-improvement has kind of become my motto for the past few years, and I've been really looking to ways to improve myself, both spiritually, physically, mentally. At this point, I'm also really getting into something called Stoicism, which is a old Greek philosophy. And in Stoicism, there's the idea of the logos, that there is a natural order to the world. And as a perennialist at this time, I sort of like, yeah, there is a natural order to the world. It does make sense that to some degree this universe was created, that there is a soul. That means that there is some sort of objectivity to this. That means there is a natural order to things. And in Stoicism, they call that the logos, which is the Greek word for word. But there's the logos. Some of you who know Christianity know where I'm going with this. I want to say that I know that there was I knew of the idea of the Word of God. I just always thought that the Word of God was the Bible, because that is the text that is said to come from God. All right. So when we get to the dramatic reveal, don't don't get on me for that. Like, surely you have heard of the Word of God, but I thought it was the Bible back then. But I was getting into Stoicism And I really believed in this concept of the Logos, that there was some sort of natural order to things. And the Logos sort of became my point that I looked towards. Perennialism doesn't give you exactly a moral system to follow. So as a perennialist, when I got into Stoicism and sort of thought of myself as a Stoic, the Logos definitely gave me a moral code to follow, that I needed to do things that were in line with the Logos and not things that went against the Logos. You can look up Stoicism if you don't know what I'm talking about, but ultimately the Logos is the natural way things are. Logos, think of the word like ology is referring to like the knowledge of everything. Let's say biology is everything we know of life, put into brackets. Sociology is everything we know about society. And the Logos is the fact that there is an ology for all of existence. The Logos is all of that for all existence. Knowledge is, in fact, order, right? It's impossible to know chaos, right? So if we want to know biology, we have to order it into something we can understand. Likewise, that, goes up. That just goes up and up. What's the opposite of fractionate? On a larger scale, there is a Logos, okay? So it seemed from a Greek philosophical standpoint that it made sense that there was a Logos. Now, anyway, so as I'm getting into Stoicism and learning about the Logos, I'm also learning about all these Catholic miracles. And my friend recommends me a book called Religion of the Apostles by Orthodox priest Father Stephen DeYoung. And he also recommends this podcast called the Lord of Spirits podcast, which is done by Father Stephen DeYoung and another Orthodox priest named Father Andrew Stephen Damick. And I do read the book, and it's incredible. I probably would cite Religion of the Apostles as the ultimate reason that I got into Christianity. Hold up. Let me check the book for one moment. So I'm reading Religion of the Apostles, and it's sort of an explanation of a lot of advanced, coming from a Southern Baptist background of what I knew Christianity to be, it was advanced, but sort of deep ideas about Christianity. There is a section in I think this is chapter 1, called The Word of God, or The Word of the Lord, and it talks about what the Word is. And it talked about how, okay, so the Word of God, yes, you have the Bible. That is the Word of God in word form. But the Word of God is a person. It's the second person of the Holy Trinity. And he talks about how the Word of God is used, how it's used more often as a person, more often than not, how it's when people encounter God in the Old Testament, it's often said that they encountered the Word and all that, and it's like, if you're imagining that it's the Bible, well, that looks weird, right? You're saying Abraham met with a book that was hovering and talking to him? Is that what you think it was? And then it talks about how the second person of the Trinity is Jesus Christ, right? And then it hits me when he starts talking about the Gospel of John, and it hits me with the Greek word for word is logos, and that Jesus Christ is the Logos made flesh. And that blew my mind, because I had believed in the Logos. I had been following the Logos as a sort of Stoic, at this point in time, as a perennialist who followed the Logos. Then realizing, having it revealed to me that the Logos was a person, and is Jesus Christ, that, I feel like my brain exploded just then, right? And then I get into the Lord of Spirits podcast, and it's like, as a perennialist, as I'm finding more and more arrows that are clearly pointing to Christianity, I have to say, like, well, what, you want me to say that every other religion just doesn't exist, that they're just imagining all these things that happened? The Greeks have no idea what they were talking about when they talked about their gods, that the Japanese don't and still don't have any idea what they're talking about when they're talking about the kami. And then I listened to the Lord of Spirits podcast, Oh boy. And they also touch up on this in The Religion of the Apostles. In the Lord of Spirits podcast, they touch up on a lot of the Christian tradition that has been lost, and a lot of important aspects of Christianity that just aren't talked about anymore. Especially in relation to the Book of Enoch. And what is revealed to me by these priests is mind-blowing, because I learn about the concept of the logos spermatikos, the idea that the logos reveals itself in other religions and in other philosophies, because in Orthodox Christianity you have the energies essence distinction, and how the essence of God is unknowable. That God is like some sort of, Lovecraftian thing that we cannot comprehend. And how it exists throughout and outside all of creation. How it's, when I'm used to the Southern Baptist explanation of God as he's our dad in the sky and we should pray to him if we need something, versus the Eastern Orthodox thing of, we have no idea what this thing is, that this ultimate creator is. We can only know it by its energies that permeate throughout the world and creation. And we know that God is love, God is truth, God is light, God is wisdom, how morality emanates from his energies, right? Just a completely different conception of God than what I was used to growing up in my American South context. In that, in order for us to know God on a certain level, the Logos sort of became a person, right? So that it could be something that we could comprehend. What was I saying? The Logos. We're talking about the Book of Enoch and that Lord of Spirits. The Logos Spermatikos shows up because God is truth and God is the Logos, so that Logos shows up in anything that is good, anything that has the truth. And as a perennialist who always believed that all religions have some sort of truth in them, there is the Logos Spermatikos. There is that idea in Christianity that all religions and philosophies that have any element of truth have that element of the Logos Spermatikos in them, right? And then it's especially shown through like Greek philosophy that is said by traditional Christians to be pointing towards God, pointing towards the coming of Christ. Especially Stoicism very much seems to have been a pre-Christian philosophy that pointed towards Christ. And that sort of caught my interest as someone who was getting into Stoicism. I feel myself just getting excited thinking about this. But I learned more about the traditional Christian view of other religions. And, the traditional Christian context was, you're surrounded by Roman and Greek and Mesopotamian pantheon worshippers and all that. And it wasn't that they thought that these gods were just non-existent. It was that they weren't gods that you should be worshipping. And then I learned about, one of the episodes on Lord of Spirits is about the 5-ish falls of angels, how that, there are angels who have fallen, and some of them have become worshipped. I learned more about sort of the idea of hypostasis, the idea of how, especially around this time I started reading Herodotus, and Herodotus talks about things like Egyptian gods. Tacitus talks about German gods, but they both relate those gods to the names of gods they know. For example, in Tacitus calls Thor, I think he calls Thor Hercules or something like that. They call their other gods like hypostases, like, how a Phoenician who worships Baal and a Babylonian that worships Marduk would see each other as worshiping the same god, even if they have different stories and different aspects to them. There's enough there in the core to believe that, they're observing the same phenomenon. And how, other gods were understood, like you see like the people form of these gods, and maybe they choose to appear like that at some point in time, but in reality the true form of these gods or spirits was as a sort of cosmic intelligence that cannot be seen. It's something that's, when you understand how ancient people thought about thinking, how that thought, we didn't create thoughts. Thoughts are spirits that come into our mind. You have the concept of the nous. This is so much stuff that I was not taught at Bible school. They didn't taught me about the nous. They didn't tell me about hypostatic union. They didn't tell me about the fallen angels in Bible school. They didn't tell me about the Tower of Babel and how there's a connection between the concept of language and the concept of religion. And I'm getting way too excited to really explain these things in a calm and structured manner. I am begging you, listen to the Lord of Spirits podcast, especially the ones about giants, especially the ones about fallen angels, right? How ultimately these gods, these Shinto gods, do, from a traditional Christian perspective, exist. Not that the myths associated with them are, especially 100% true, and it's not that they should be worshipped, but that these creatures, these beings exist. And maybe they don't exist exactly how we've recorded them, but those recordings are recording something. And I get into more like Greek philosophy and, other literature, and everything is falling together. All the pieces are coming together. And again, I am too excited to put this into proper words. Do I even want to try to explain it? Sure, let's go ahead and try. So this is Orthodox theology explained very poorly by Commander Radix. So, God created the world. And do we want to get into why he created? It's like with this stuff, I don't even know where to begin. Do I need to explain why he created it? It's because there's an outflowing of his love between the... You know what, let's just skip that part. Alright, let's move on to how it affects my spiritual journey. So, after all my research into traditional Christianity, I'm talking like, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century Christianity, I find that traditional Christianity is the only religion that really explains other religions and has enough miracles supporting it in and of itself to where that sort of traditional Christianity is what I thought was correct. Which left me in sort of a conundrum. Because, so at this point I've moved to the Rad Fort. I've left the Rad Cave. I'm at the Rad Fort now. My second apartment in Japan. And I'm left with 3 options. Because I don't think the Protestant Reformation, or at least the Low Church, is really on it. I have to be connected to something apostolic and connected to the High Church. Which leaves me with the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, or the Anglican Communion, the Anglican Church. Those were my 3 choices that I had in front of me, and I looked into all of them. And at the end of the day, with the Catholic Church, again, I had the same issues with the Pope that I brought up earlier this episode. I had the same issues with papal supremacy. I do not see that reflected in the tradition. It could not be something that it couldn't be Catholic as it stands right now. That doesn't mean that I don't see the Catholic Church as valid, and Orthodox Christians are going to be angry at me for saying this. But I do think that the Catholics have a somewhat legitimate claim to traditional Christianity, right? Look, I came into Christianity through Catholic miracles. I'm not going to deny the Catholic Church in its entirety. Not like how I would deny a Pentecostal or something like that. The Anglican Church, to be honest, for a while I did want to be Anglo-Catholic. I did want to be a traditional Anglican. But the fact of the matter is that just isn't an option because there are no traditional Anglican churches in where I live. And while I do think, yeah, the Anglican Church does have apostolic succession, there's just so much going wrong with the Anglican Church. They're leaving a lot of biblical teachings, let's say, and it's just collapsing. The Anglican Church is a mess right now. Technically, all three of these branches are a mess right now. But there are a lot of Anglican ideas that I have in my own, I pray the morning and evening office, which is an Anglican thing, started by the Anglicans. I'm using a Western Orthodox prayer book, though, that sort of altered the Anglican thing. Branch theory, I do have a sort of, maybe not exactly how it's written, but I do have an understanding of branch theory of being as, yeah, even though these aren't Orthodox churches, I do think there is some degree of legitimacy to them. That makes me a bad Orthodox Christian, but yeah. But I eventually came to the conclusion that Orthodox Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, was going to be the route I would go down. And ideally, if I had the option available to me, I would want to do a Western Rite Orthodox church, but there are none here. Because it does feel weird having a lot of Greek stuff going on in my church when I am not Greek. But anyway, I did choose to go to the Orthodox Church, and this happened when I was doing my sort of challenge to stay away from the internet. I was philosophically like, yeah, it's going to be one of these three for a while, and it wasn't until I decided to stop using the internet as much where I finally decided to make a decision and go to a church. So it took some time, but by November, I was finally regularly attending a church. Now, I am attending an Eastern Orthodox church, which means it's going to take me like a year before I actually become a member of the church, because like other churches, other types of Christians, oh, you want to come? Sure, come on in, you're a Christian now. The Orthodox church is like, you want to come join us? We got to spend a year vetting you, making sure you're right for this. It's amazing how like you have the idea of a cult and how they just are desperate for people. You have Jehovah's Witnesses going to your door and begging you to join, but then the Orthodox Christian church is like, okay, let's take it slow. Let's take it a year before we even consider bringing you into the church. It's just such a not weird, but it's such a unique experience. But yeah, I'd seen enough legitimacy to Christianity to choosing and seeing that, especially traditional Christianity. And I've found that the Eastern Orthodox Church, which does have its own messes, it does have its own problems, it's not perfect. I know I memed on every other branch of Christianity in this episode. It's certainly not perfect. But I do think it has been the closest at maintaining traditional Christianity. And I do think that traditional Christianity is ultimately the true faith for me. I am learning so much more about Christianity. I'm learning so much more about myself on this journey. This isn't going to become a channel where like I preach the gospel, right? This isn't going to really affect that. But I'm talking off the cuff too much. Let me check my outline. But yeah, it's helping me develop a sort of ancient mindset, a medieval synthesis with new information. Yeah, how I would describe my mindset now, since I'm converting to Orthodox Christianity, is that sort of my ideas have shifted a bit. I don't like, I wish I could put this more elegantly, but I'm realizing that there were a lot of mistakes that have gone down in like the Renaissance and in the Enlightenment and in modernity. And how I would describe myself as an old soul. And as an old soul, I don't mean a guy who misses like the 1980s. I mean that I am very much turning into an ancient person. I think the height of civilization was probably with the medieval synthesis in the medieval age. And my outlook on life is very much like a medievalist, like someone from the medieval period who's incorporating more information. Right? I don't know, that gets deep, and I don't know if I'm eloquent enough to fully explain what I mean by that. But it's felt like I've come home. I don't know, this is getting wishy-washy, this is getting ooh-wooey, this is getting whimsical. Let's move on. Why am I saying this? Why am I making this podcast? The reason I'm making this podcast is to just record my spiritual journey. Understanding, just trying to let people know that I've sort of changed in my mindset and in how I look at the world and how I look at relations with people. And I think that sort of change is becoming obvious, especially if you see with how I interact with people on social media, what sort of personality I try to convey in my videos. There's been a shift, and I think that's noticeable, and I think people are going to wonder why that's going on, why that shift has taken place. And I just wanted a video explaining all that, especially, if people ask me, why did you become an Orthodox Christian? Why did blah, blah, blah? Then I have this podcast to direct them to. I do regret a lot of things I've done in the past, a lot of the ways I've treated people in the past. I'm not going to take any videos down, but I do think if you look at my older content, I want you to keep that in mind. Yeah. This podcast has gotten way too long, and I don't know how to eloquently talk about these things anymore. We've sort of completed the spiritual journey. Do I want to talk about the ghost incident? We'll leave the ghost story for another day. Maybe if you have any questions, I'll answer them in the next podcast, because I know this is going to open up to a lot of questions. This isn't going to become a Christian channel in the sense where I talk about the Bible, but it is Christian in the sense that the person behind the channel is Christian and the content is being made by someone with a Christian mindset. Yeah. I don't know how to end these things. Thank you so much for listening to this super long podcast. Hopefully you're doing something productive while listening to it. I don't know. But thank you again so much. Subscribe to this channel if you have not yet. And have a great day, ladies and gentlemen.